Welcome to Trench Diaries. Now, before we begin with episode 32 of Iron Coffins, I want to take a quick moment and thank you all for your support here. We are nearing the 3000 subscriber mark, and when I started this channel in June last year, I would have never imagined that it would grow at such a pace. For this, I am very grateful, and I have to say the community here is one of the best and nicest I have ever seen. So, thank you for being here and watching my videos. If you want to go the extra mile, I would like to point out that you can become a channel member and support me even more. Starting at $1.99 a month, you get access to exclusive videos as well as some cool badges and emotes. I would also like to make a shout out at this point to those of you who are members already. That is Barb, Graham Harris, John in NH, Simo Mark, Klaus Doll, Gilles Bordelot and Albert Bear. Thank you guys so much for your generosity, I appreciate it immensely. Anyway, onwards to the next story and to 3000 subscribers. Thank you and cheers. It took us 3 nights of fast surface travel and countless involuntary diving maneuvers to evade the area larve gifts before we penetrated into the Gulf of Lyon in front of Marseille. On December the 15th at 1 o'clock, we informed High Command of our impending arrival. At dawn, we submerged. And after some searching, Siegmann recognized through the periscope a patrol boat zigzagging nervously over the horizon. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, we surfaced in front of the bow of the nervously crossing vessel. A flag signal recommended us to be on high alert. English submarines had sunk one of our patrol boats 2 weeks earlier, and a submarine even before that. We steamed behind the security vessel, ordering everyone on deck to wear life jackets. In the entrance to the port of Toulon, a tugboat opened the floating steel net that protected the harbor from the ingress of enemy submarines and allowed us to pass through. We entered the new harbor at half speed. A magnificent panorama unfolded before us. The bright winter sun shone on green mountains, red and green tiled roofs, whitewashed houses, and the rusty superstructures of some damaged and grounded French warships. U-230 maneuvered carefully through the inner harbor basin. We passed 2 sunken French destroyers and 3 German submarines lying completely unprotected at the pier. Siegmann spotted a modest gathering of men in navy blue and steered U-230 towards an empty space at the dock. What we had considered a suicide mission in Brest had turned into a tense but interesting sea voyage. Our luck was still with us. The gentlemen of the 29th U-boat flotilla received us with the familiar greetings and entertained us with an excellent meal. Our luggage had been delivered from Brest and the mail redirected. Nothing was forgotten to make our stay in our new quarters as pleasant as possible. I was just unpacking my suitcase when Siegmann's intelligence officer called me to the commander. "Here, XO, take a cigarette," said Siegmann. "I have a telegram from High Command. You are assigned to the commander training course in Neustadt starting in January. Congratulations." Before I could grasp it, Siegmann stood up and shook my hand. He wished me a better future with one of the modern boats than he could expect with his very old U-230. Still surprised, I thanked him for the 20 months I had served under him, wished him continued luck, and soon a command of a new boat. Then we discussed the immediate problems arising from the changed situation. The majority of the crew, including Riedel and Friedrich, were scheduled for an extended leave. Since my training did not begin until January the 10th, 1944, I was prepared to take care of the boat and the men and spend 2 weeks in a port city that I did not know yet. On December the 18th, 2 days after our arrival, the crew was introduced to the commanding admiral of the Mediterranean. He showered us with praise and awards. As he pinned another iron cross to my uniform, I couldn't help but think about how unevenly the iron was distributed. I thought of my friends and comrades who lay in their iron coffins on the ocean floor. On this sunny day in December of 1943, the old guard of the Atlantic front was almost completely wiped out. And many of the newcomers who had sailed from German ports had been sunk in the Norwegian Sea or the North Passage before they could reach their operational destination. Even the Mediterranean was a single submarine trap. Once you were in, you couldn't get out. The last boat to fall victim to the Allied superiority was U-593 under the command of Kapitän-Leutnant Kelbling, who had once sailed with us on U-557 in the Atlantic. His successful career came to a sudden end after 13 patrols. After sinking 2 British destroyers off the North African coast, he was intercepted by American destroyers. Fortunately, Kelbling and his crew were rescued. What our boats could not achieve in a battle over 4 long years, maritime supremacy over the Atlantic that is, the Allies had achieved in less than 7 months. Their massive efforts to clear the seas of submarines had borne fruit, and by mid-December, the Allies had destroyed 386 boats, of which 237 had been sunk in 1943 alone. One day after the awards ceremony, Siegmann and most of the crew went on leave. I acquainted myself with the officers at the base. My new friends wasted no time in introducing me to the nightlife of the port. We celebrated the occasions as they came, and they came in very rapid succession, and then we celebrated with reckless abandon. On one of those evenings, I attended a party where ladies and gentlemen bathed in a bathtub full of wine and champagne before retiring. At another, highly private event, a dark-haired Italian woman caused a dramatic scene by throwing herself naked into the arms of a surprised infantry lieutenant who was a guest. And just as the mild climate of the Côte d'Azur had convinced me that spring was around the corner, Christmas arrived. The imported and very sparse fir trees, adorned with tinsel and angel hair, made the holidays seem quite surreal. In the week after Christmas, a bus took us through the coastal area. An abundance of flowers, cypresses and pines accompanied us on the way between the holiday resorts Lavardon, Saint-Tropez and Saint-Maxime. The landscape resembled the colorful paintings sold on the streets of Paris. New Year's Eve became a special occasion with the arrival of a Wehrmacht support troop. I danced with the young girls from the ballet through the night and into the new year, forgetting for a few hours that the seas trembled with death charges, that our cities were collapsing under Allied bomb carpets, and that the ground in Russia was rumbling under the onslaught of the Soviet steamroller. My days in Toulon came to an end when Riedel returned from his leave. He hadn't had much luck with his trip. Due to the devastating air raids, he hadn't been able to make it to his Bohemian homeland. Instead, he had spent most of his vacation on trains, in train stations, and in Munich. I handed over my duties and affairs to my friend, who was taking over as XO on U-230. As a farewell, I admonished him. Remember, Heinz, keep your eyes open and your ears sharp. Caution is half of life. Indeed, this was my farewell to Heinz Riedel. A year later, he fell on his first patrol as commander of U-242 in the final round of the Battle of Britain. My journey to the commander's course in Neustadt began on the evening of January 5, 1944. I was driven from Toulon by one of my new friends with suicidal speed along the winding coastal road to Marseille. Our haste had a reason. As it was, we had arranged to meet with the ballet girls from New Year's Eve and were already running late. Minutes before midnight, we entered the small hotel on the Canebière where the girls were staying. To our disappointment, the troop had left in the morning. My friend preferred to drive back to Toulon despite the late hour rather than pay a fee for a disappointing night. I, on the other hand, had a room with a view of the Canebière, closed the door at noon, changed into my civilian suit, and began to explore the most infamous city in Europe. Sailors, beggars, former French soldiers in their old uniforms, thieves, pimps, prostitutes, Arabs, Chinese, people of all shades and colors mixed here in apparent harmony. I wandered through the winding streets of the old town, along the foul-smelling old docks, observed the decrepit fishing boats and ancient ships of bygone times. I boarded a small motorboat and sailed through the oily harbor to the notorious Château d'If, famous as the alleged prison of the Count of Monte Cristo. In the evening I strolled through the elegant quarters and finally retired to a cozy restaurant where an excellent dinner was served. On January the 6th at 8 o'clock, I climbed the white marble stairs to St. Charles train station and settled into an empty compartment of the express train to Strasbourg. While peacefully carried through the Rhône Valley, through the summery mountains and valleys of southern France, Soviet divisions were shelling our lines in Russia to kick off their winter offensive. Americans were bombing our Italian front to break through to Rome, and the Tommies on their English islands were warming up the engines of thousands of bombers for a night raid on Germany. At 10:30 p.m., my express train arrived in Strasbourg and crossed the Rhine at Kehl. In Mannheim, the train was delayed considerably. The locomotive seemed restless and panting in the pitch-black station. To find out the cause of the delay, I stepped out of a warm carriage into the harsh winter cold. An official explained in a subdued voice that Frankfurt was under heavy air attack. "They say it's the worst. Looks like we'll be stuck here for the rest of the night," he said. I felt the sudden urge to rush ahead of the train to Frankfurt. What might have happened to my parents in those moments? And then, finally, the train moved forward. creeping through Mannheim's sprawling freight yard and then advancing with agonizing slowness through the burning Frankfurt. A grey, misty and cold morning ended a torturous night as the train cautiously pulled into the damaged Frankfurt Central Station. I grabbed my suitcases and hurried through the smell of fire and cordite, through clouds of dust and mountains of shattered glass onto the street. The stately rotunda of once proud buildings that lined the square in front of the station had been transformed into a smoldering pile of rubble. A huge cloud of black smoke hung over the city, and fire engines, military vehicles, ambulances, air raid wardens, and thousands of people crowded the streets, all working together to fight the flames and clear the thoroughfares of debris and rubble. I stumbled over debris at the edge of countless bomb craters, ran across the station square, turned into Mainzer Landstraße, skirted a giant crater gaping in the middle of the street. I noticed thousands of aluminum foils dropped by bombers to disrupt our radar, and gasped through the last 50 meters. What I saw then relieved me of my greatest fears. Our house was still standing. I opened the iron gate, ran through the front garden to the front door, and rang the bell. There was no answer. Assuming the bell wasn't working, I ran into the garden, calling for my parents. But where there had once been a garden, there was now a mound of bricks, mortar, iron railings, window frames, glass radiators, pipes and debris of all kinds. The entire back wall of the house had been shaved off by a bomb. All 5 floors were completely exposed, and 4 of the 5 floors were gutted. The exception was the second floor, our apartment. I recognized my parents' bedroom. The furniture was still as it used to be, but the beds were unused. A layer of dust covered the white bed linen. There was the sewing room with the sewing machine standing in front of an imaginary wall. And there was my sister's room with the turquoise furniture. In the outermost corner of the apartment, a bathtub hung halfway in the air. And there was no sign of my parents or my sister. A woman appeared on the ground floor and called out to me, "It's time for someone to take care of things. We were wondering why no one was taking care of the furniture. You've come just in time." I recognized the landlord's wife and said, "Could you unlock the door to our apartment for me? I don't have a key." "Of course. I'll also give you a key and alert some neighbors. They'll help you clean up the apartment." Her calm and carefree demeanor was refreshing. I heard that my parents had gone to the Black Forest. For a few days, they had said. The woman handed me the key, and I entered our apartment like an intruder. The doors of the back rooms were lifted out of the frames and shattered. Pictures had fallen from the walls. The floor was littered with things that had been swept off the dressers and tables. Relatively little was destroyed, only glassware and some porcelain vases. But a thick layer of mortar dust covered furniture, beds and floors. Facing an almost impossible cleaning task, I put on old clothes I found in my room and then answered the knock on the glass door. I had expected strong male help and was surprised to face 4 middle-aged women dressed in their light grey work clothes, looking like professional movers. They took over our apartment as if it were their own, and together we pushed, transported and squeezed the furniture through the door openings into the front rooms. It was late in the afternoon when the women left me, without accepting my thanks. I washed myself in the remaining bathroom with cold water, squeezed into my dusty uniform, and made my way through the debris to the military command. Here I received a small bundle of food ration cards and a stamp on my ticket. With that, I sent a telegram to my new command explaining the reason for my delay. In another, I urged my parents to return immediately. Then I looked for an opportunity to eat. But this plan encountered significant difficulties. 4 well-known pre-war establishments turned out to be bombed-out ruins. In the 5th, a well-known hotel on Kaiserstraße, the fine linen tablecloths and napkins had been replaced by paper and the elegant waiters by grumpy waitresses. Dinner was a bitter shock after the appetizing meal I had been served in Marseille. It was a bitter irony. The French, who had lost the war, ate like kings, while we, the victors, had to sustain ourselves with potatoes and substitutes to stay alive. As night descended on the city and its citizens trembled in fear of a new attack, I returned to our shattered home and listened to the air raid warning broadcast over the radio until the threat of a new attack had passed. I awoke in the bright sunlight and let my eyes wander over the strange yet familiar furnishings. On the wall opposite my bed hung a drawing of a nude woman in the dunes. I had drawn her when I was 18. Mother had always wondered who had modeled for me. Next to it hung a reproduction of Rembrandt's Man with the Golden Helmet. On the wall opposite the window I had attached flags, headbands and other emblems. and on the shelves on the wall were the books I had purchased in shops scattered throughout Europe. This was my room, which I had left in 1939 to go to war, which, I was told, would be won within a few months. It was dark again when a key turned in the glass door. My parents had returned. Mother and Trudel were dismayed and confused, but father said with an audible sigh of relief, "Well then, we'll just have to get used to the smaller floor space, I guess. Could have been much worse. Let's be glad we are back together. Let's drink to that." Father opened a bottle of Mosel wine, and we toasted to my double promotion and to our conviction that the Allies would have to strike much harder to throw us off balance. We sat animated and tense until around 3 in the morning in the drawing room, talking, telling stories, and listening to the voice of the speaker conveying the warnings about enemy air raids. Assured that no Allied bombers were flying to Frankfurt, we risked going to bed. Late into the following night, after disembarking what must have been the slowest train of the entire Reichsbahn, I arrived in the Baltic seaport of Neustadt. The Kriegsmarine had housed its most advanced submarine training department here, and I found an empty bunk in one of the clean wooden barracks and threw myself onto a mattress filled with straw. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I was assigned as a latecomer to a small group of aspiring commanders who were practicing on a special apparatus. This was a complex device representing the interior of a submarine tower with rudder control and periscope, and was mounted over a large basin in such a way that it could be moved in any direction by the trainee commander. This setup, together with a number of small models of cargo steamers, tankers, destroyers and other warships that could execute any imaginable formation remotely controlled in the basin, allowed the future commander to familiarize himself with all the tricks of underwater attack. Bringing quite some experience from the front, I easily passed the course. And after 2 weeks of intense training and boring life in the small town, I welcomed my assignment to the war flotilla in Danzig. On a late January day, I boarded the express train to the east in Berlin. The platform swarmed with infantrymen of all ranks rushing the train to secure a seat for the long journey to the Russian front, even if by force. Soon my compartment was filled with infantry officers smoking their self-rolled cigarettes made from Russian Majorka tobacco, a tobacco they had learned to smoke due to the lack of better options. It didn't take long for me to offer them my aromatic cigarettes with Turkish tobacco, which were available to us Navy personnel. This gesture significantly improved the relationship between the two branches of the armed forces and the atmosphere in the compartment. As the express train raced eastward, we discussed the war in general and the campaigns in Russia in particular. Those frontline men were convinced that despite the unstoppable Soviet assaults, our lines would hold. One Hauptmann said, "The few meters we yield here and there are merely strategic adjustments. The Soviets do not have our industrial potential," claimed another. "They do not have the material to sustain their attacks or intercept our counterattacks." Then a third said, "Their crude equipment can never match our new modern weapons. Just wait until summer comes." These were men of fighting units. They all believed that in the spring, our weapons and a new tactic would drastically change the sometimes confusing situations on the various fronts. As we approached Danzig, I wished them luck in the Russian steppe. In Danzig, I took a tram near the pier where the large ocean liners of the Hamburg-America line had been moored for years in stately elegance. My accommodation was an antique state cabin with plush and velvet. Although it smelled strongly of mothballs and cigars, I felt an immediate fondness for the old ship. I found the flotilla commander, Kapitänleutnant Lüth, in the bar, surrounded by a group of future commanders. Lüth, a former commander with over 250,000 tons of enemy shipping to his credit, greeted me in a highly unmilitary manner and introduced me to the men of the course. I learned that besides me, only one other man came from the U-boat force. None of the other course participants had, as was previously customary, participated in a deployment as commander trainees. They had been assigned from destroyers, minesweepers, merchant ships and even desk positions to complement our staggering losses. These newcomers had received a year of U-boat training to learn what had cost me 3 years of the toughest frontline service. They all lacked what only deployment can teach: the absolute mastery of the boat in all perilous situations, the ability to make split-second decisions, the anticipation of the opponent's next move, the experience of when to dive and when to stay up and shoot, the skill to maintain control of the boat when depth charges and bombs rained down and 1,000 failures made the plunge into infinity seem inevitable. These newcomers, who would be entrusted with the command of a boat in a few weeks, had only a slim chance of surviving their first encounter with the enemy. Our firing exercises began before dawn the following day. 7 submarines and a small fleet of surface vessels left the harbor heading east into the Baltic Sea. Our practice torpedoes, driven by compressed air, allowed us to track the bubble trails and evaluate our daytime shots. For night shooting, the torpedoes were equipped with the usual illuminating head so that we could register our shots in the darkness. Our instructors, experienced commanders, rushed us through a tough school through hair-raising maneuvers that forced us to think and act correctly instantly. These exercises became routine for us after 3 long weeks. We had hardly any time to sleep and therefore little interest in tempting shore excursions. At the end of the course, we gathered in the mess of the old steamship for the first time in 3 weeks in white shirts and black ties. We were to be briefed on our performance. Here I learned that I had passed with the highest score. As a reward, I wished for command of a new wonderboat. 2 evenings later, I received the order that would crown my naval career. We had gathered for a farewell party in the smoky bar of the steamship. The commander gave a speech full of praise and good wishes for the future. Then he reached for a bundle of telegrams and said, "Gentlemen, I have here the instructions for your future assignments in the submarine service. I will start with the only frontline command I have to offer today. The lucky winner of the main prize is Lieutenant Werner." I jumped to my feet. Lüth's voice suddenly seemed distant, as if coming through a thick fog. I heard Lüth say, "You will report to the 1st U-boat flotilla in Brest on April the 1st and take command of U-415. I accepted the command, even though it was as good as a death sentence. The lifespan of a frontline boat had shrunk to 3 or 4 months, and U-415 had already survived too many patrols. What awaited me with taking over this new command was merely a switch from one vessel to another. I returned to my table. I managed to smile and conceal my annoyance. Instead of giving me a new wonderboat, one of those total submarines now being built in all available shipyards and requiring experienced personnel, leadership had dictated to me a completely outdated vessel. To alleviate my frustration, leadership allowed me a 2-week leave before I had to take up my new command. March was a good month for skiing, and I headed towards the Alps. I expected plenty of snow and fast descents there. In Berlin, I changed trains, closed my eyes to the devastation, and traveled on a slow local train through smoldering cities and untouched villages. On the 2nd day of my journey, I arrived in Neustadt in Bavaria around 2 p.m. I left the compartment to catch the local train to Oberstdorf. Another train, which had just pulled into the small station, discharged a wave of passengers blocking my way. Suddenly, I heard someone calling my name. I turned around and looked into the face of a girl I had been friends with an infinitely long time ago. I dropped my luggage on the platform, and without hesitation, she threw herself into my arms. "What a surprise, Marika! What are you doing here?" "I'm passing through," she said. "Me too. Where are you headed from here?" "I'm going back home. I've been with my parents in Überlingen for a while." I wondered why Marika had orchestrated this reunion. She could have just let me pass by, just as she had done many years ago. But before I could find an answer, Marika suggested, "Let's skip the trains. We can't part ways after only seeing each other for a few seconds." We inquired about the departure of our trains and discovered that we had nearly 3 hours before we had to part ways again. We checked our luggage at the baggage storage and stepped out onto the snow-covered street. Marika linked her arm with mine, dragging and answering my questions. She had beautiful blonde hair and her facial features had matured. We found an empty table in a cafe near the station and sat by a window, offering a wonderful view of the snow-capped mountain peaks. 8 years had blurred the memory of our youthful friendship. We had often met in the rose garden of the small medieval town on Lake Constance, where the roses bloomed until December. We had been in love for the first time in our young lives and hadn't known what to do with our discovery. There had been nothing between us, just promises, kisses, and cautious embraces. When I bid farewell to the lake back then, we had vowed to write to each other often. But 8 months later, her letters stopped. 12 months were enough to transform Marika into a bride. The news of her wedding put an end to the role she had played in my life, and since then I had almost completely forgotten her, until she crossed my path again. Marika tearfully explained to me what had broken our love back then. It was a classic story. Sometime in March 1938, she met a young student who seduced her during a cheerful carnival night. Soon, she discovered with horror that she was pregnant. The result? A wedding and the birth of a child she hadn't wanted. Humiliations followed. Domestic violence, as she called it, filled the years. And now she found me again. She pleaded, "Please, don't leave me today, not now after we found each other again. Let's make the best out of this coincidence. Please, spend your vacation with me." At first, I resisted, but it wasn't hard to reignite the old feelings for her. I suggested we go to Oberstdorf together, where nobody knew us and where we could register as a man and a woman. I bought a second ticket, retrieved our luggage at the counter, and then we boarded the old-fashioned train to Oberstdorf. Time for the after-action report. As is tradition with Herbert, a new woman has stepped into his life. Although strictly speaking, Marika isn't new, they just lost touch for a while. We see how it turns out in future episodes. But let's look at the current episode first. Herbert has received his first command after having spent 3 years at sea, almost to the day. And being a seasoned sailor, he breezed through the command course but is understandably disappointed for not becoming captain of a new Type 21 boat. Him becoming a captain means leaving U230 and her captain, Paul Siegmann. So this is a good moment to talk about the fate of both. But don't worry, it's not as sad as the fate of U557. So let's start with Siegmann himself. Siegmann indeed became a captain of a Type 21 boat, specifically U-2507. U-2507 was scuttled as part of Operation Rainbow at the end of the war after transporting refugees from Eastern Prussia to Germany. Siegmann himself died in 1986 at the ripe age of 73. Unfortunately, that's all that's known of him. U-230 went out to sea with a new captain but went aground somewhere on the French coast. It was destroyed by German artillery shortly after, and its new crew tried to get to Spain to be interred, but they were captured by the Americans after a couple of weeks. All of them survived. Another interesting figure in this episode is the commander of the training flotilla in Neustadt, Captain Wolfgang Lüth. Lüth was highly decorated as a U-boat captain with over 250,000 tons to his name. He was one of only 2 U-boat captains to receive the 4th level of the Knight's Cross. Now, Lüth was a staunch Nazi and as such is a somewhat controversial figure, to put it mildly. But one would guess that a bearer of the Knight's Cross would have had some influence after the war. As it turns out, fate has a sense of irony. Lüth, drunk at the time, forgot the proper challenge call-out when he walked through the naval base at night. He met his fate at the hands of a German sentry who shot and killed him for failing to answer. Classic. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you again in the next episode. Cheers and bye-bye.